Welcome back to the channel, and today we are diving deep into one of the most talked about and controversial Hollywood sequels of the early 2000s. We are talking about Son of the Mask, the 2005 superhero comedy film that tried to follow up one of the most beloved and iconic films of the 1990s. Whether you watched it as a kid and have fond memories of it, or you are someone who heard about it for the first time and want to know what all the noise is about, this video is going to give you every single detail you need. From the overview to the full plot breakdown, from the cast to the release date, we have got it all covered. So sit back, relax, and let us get into it. Overview. Son of the Mask is a 2005 American superhero comedy film directed by Lawrence Guterman, who had previously directed the 2001 family film Cats and Dogs. It is a standalone sequel to the iconic 1994 film The Mask, making it the second entry in the Mask franchise. The story is rooted in the mythology of Norse gods, specifically the character of Loki, the god of mischief, and his magical mask that grants supernatural powers to whoever wears it. The film was produced under the banner of New Line Cinema, an American film production and distribution studio based in the United States, and was written by Tom Gamble. It is primarily an American production, and the majority of its filming took place at Fox Studios Australia in Sydney, Australia, even though it is set in a fictional American town called Fringe City. The film was designed as a family comedy aimed at younger audiences, drawing heavy inspiration from classic cartoons such as Tom and Jerry, Looney Tunes, and the animated works of Chuck Jones. The visual effects were handled by two of the most respected studios in Hollywood, Industrial Light and Magic, commonly known as ILM, and Tippett Studio. Despite having a massive budget and a strong visual effects team behind it, the film faced significant challenges from the moment it went into production, largely because the original star of the franchise, Jim Carrey, chose not to return. This decision fundamentally altered the direction of the sequel and set the tone for how it would eventually be received by audiences and critics alike. Plot details. The story begins approximately 10 years after the events of the first film. Dr. Arthur Newman, played by Ben Stein, who is the only returning cast member from the original 1994 film, is giving a guided tour through a hall dedicated to Norse mythology at the Edge City Museum. During this tour, he explains the legend of Loki, the Norse god of mischief, and describes how Loki created a powerful magical mask and released it into the world to spread chaos among human beings. He also explains that Loki is the youngest son of Odin, the king of the Norse gods, and that Loki's constant mischief and troublemaking eventually led his father Odin to punish him with imprisonment. As Dr. Newman speaks, a mysterious figure dressed in dark clothing enters the museum and listens carefully. This figure soon reveals himself to be Loki, played by Cumming, who is furious at the way his story is being told. In a burst of rage, Loki reaches out to claim the mask on display, only to discover that it is a fake replica. Enraged, he leaves the museum and begins his desperate search for the real mask of Loki. The story then shifts to a fictional town called Fringe City, where we are introduced to our main character, Tim Avery, played by Jamie Kennedy. Tim is an aspiring cartoonist who has been working at an animation company for 10 years without much progress in his career. He is married to a woman named Tonya, played by Traylor, and the two of them are expecting their first child. Tim, however, is deeply reluctant about becoming a father. He feels unprepared, unsure of himself, and deeply overwhelmed by the idea of raising a child. He is also very close to his pet dog, a lovable animal named Otis, nicknamed Bear. One day, Otis the dog wanders near a creek and discovers an ancient mysterious mask lying in the water. He brings it home, and Tim eventually finds it. On the night of the company's Halloween party, Tim puts on the mask without fully understanding its power. The moment he wears it, he transforms into a wild, manic, cartoon-like version of himself, brimming with the supernatural powers of Loki. He dances, performs outrageous stunts, and becomes the life of the party in the most extreme way imaginable. Later that night, Tim returns home still wearing the mask and conceives a child with his wife Tonya. 9 months later, Tonya gives birth to a baby boy named Alvy, played by the Falconer twins, Liam and Ryan Falconer. However, Alvy is no ordinary baby. Because he was conceived while Tim was wearing the mask of Loki, Alvy has been born with the full supernatural powers of the mask embedded within him. He does not need to wear the mask to access these abilities. The baby can stretch his face, morph his body, defy the laws of physics, produce objects out of thin air, and perform all manner of impossible cartoon-like acts at will. Parenting a normal baby is already an exhausting and life-changing experience, but parenting a baby with the powers of a Norse god is an entirely different level of chaos. Tim and Tonya struggle immensely to manage Alvy's powers. Every moment with the baby is unpredictable. Alvy uses his abilities freely, causing destruction around the house and making ordinary situations completely unmanageable. Tim begins to feel like he is losing control of his life entirely. His career is suffering, his relationship with his wife is under strain, and now his infant son is essentially a miniature god who cannot be reasoned with. Meanwhile, Otis the dog begins to feel deeply jealous of the baby. Before Alvy was born, Otis was the center of Tim's world and received all of his love and attention. Now, Otis feels pushed aside and neglected. In his jealousy, Otis finds the mask of Loki and puts it on himself. Wearing the mask, Otis becomes a powerful and mischievous force, and he begins plotting against baby Alvy in classic cartoon fashion. The dynamic between Otis and Alvy becomes a full-blown Tom and Jerry-style rivalry, with the dog and the baby engaging in escalating battles involving outrageous cartoon physics, impossible contraptions, and over-the-top slapstick humor. At the same time, Loki is closing in. He has been ordered by his father Odin, played by Bob Hoskins, to retrieve the mask of Loki before Odin loses his patience entirely. Loki travels to Fringe City and begins tracking the mask. He disguises himself and infiltrates the lives of the Avery family, determined to get the mask back at any cost. His interactions with the human world are filled with dark humor and chaos, as Loki is a god who has very little understanding of or patience for ordinary human life. As the story builds toward its climax, Tim must confront his fears about fatherhood, take responsibility for his family, and find a way to deal with both Loki and the chaos that the mask has brought into his life. Odin eventually arrives as well, furious at Loki for his failures, and the entire situation reaches a dramatic and colorful conclusion involving gods, magic, and the power of parental love. Tim ultimately proves himself as a father, the mask situation is resolved, and the family is able to move forward with their lives. Cast: Jamie Kennedy plays the lead role of Tim Avery, the aspiring cartoonist and reluctant new father who becomes entangled in the world of the Mask of Loki. Kennedy was a well-known television comedian at the time, famous for his work on the sketch comedy series The Jamie Kennedy Experiment. Alan Cumming plays Loki, the Norse god of mischief and the primary antagonist of the film. Cumming is a Scottish actor with an extensive and highly respected career in both film and theater, and his portrayal of Loki is theatrical, over the top, and intentionally exaggerated to match the tone of the movie. Traylor Howard plays Tonya Avery, Tim's wife and the mother of baby Alvy. Howard is an American actress known primarily for her television work. Cal Penn plays Jorge, Tim's best friend and co-worker. Penn is an Indian-American actor who would go on to become widely known for his role in the Harold and Kumar film series. Stephen Wright plays Daniel Moss, Tim's boss at the animation company. Wright is an American stand-up comedian and actor known for his distinctive deadpan delivery. Bob Hoskins plays Odin, the king of the Norse gods and Loki's powerful and stern father. Hoskins was a legendary British actor with decades of acclaimed work behind him, including his iconic role in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Ben Stein appears in a brief cameo as Dr. Arthur Newman, reprising his role from the original 1994 film. He is the only cast member from the first film to appear in the sequel. Liam Falconer and Ryan Falconer, a pair of infant twins, portray baby Alvy, whose expressions and movements were then enhanced through digital visual effects to give the baby his supernatural cartoon-like abilities. A dog named Bear portrays Otis, Tim's loyal but jealous pet. Release date and production details. Principal photography on Son of the Mask began on November 24, 2003, and wrapped on April 3, 2004. The film was primarily shot at Fox Studios Australia in Sydney, Australia, even though the story is set in the fictional American city of Fringe City. The production was an exhausting one by all accounts. Jamie Kennedy himself stated that filming was incredibly draining, largely due to the constant work required with the infant twins and the dog on set, combined with heavy deadline pressure and ongoing rewrites happening throughout the shoot. The film was originally intended to be released in the summer of 2004, but it was delayed first to October 15, 2004, and then delayed again to its final theatrical release date of February 18, 2005. It was distributed by New Line Cinema in the United States. In Germany, it was released on March 10, 2005, by Warner Bros. Pictures. The film carried a production budget estimated between $84 million and $100 million, which was an enormous amount of money for a family comedy film. Despite this massive investment, Son of the Mask grossed approximately $59.9 million worldwide, making it a significant box office failure since it did not even recover its production costs. Upon release, the film was widely panned by critics. Legendary film critic Roger Ebert gave it only 1.5 stars out of 4. On the Rotten Tomatoes review aggregation platform, the film holds an extremely low critical rating. It was nominated for 8 Golden Raspberry Awards in 2006, commonly known as the Razzies, which are awards given out to celebrate the worst films of the year. It won the Razzie for Worst Remake or Sequel, among other wins that year. It has since been frequently cited as one of the worst films ever made. The poor reception of the film had a lasting impact on Jamie Kennedy personally. He was so affected by the backlash and harsh criticism he received that he went on to co-create a 2007 documentary film called Heckler, which explored the culture of hecklers and professional film critics. As for the future of the Mask franchise, in December 2024, Jim Carrey revealed that he remains open to returning to the role of the Mask in a potential sequel, depending on the concept and idea being developed. So the story of this franchise may not be fully over just yet. Son of the Mask, 2005, The Complete Story. The Beginning, The Legend of Loki and the Mask. The story of Son of the Mask begins not with our main characters, but with a piece of ancient mythology that sets the entire foundation of the film. The audience is taken to the Edge City Museum, where a respected academic named Dr. Arthur Newman is leading a guided tour through a hall dedicated entirely to Norse mythology. Dr. Newman is an enthusiastic and knowledgeable guide, and he takes great pleasure in explaining the legends of the Norse gods to the group of tourists gathered around him. He begins speaking about Loki, one of the most fascinating and troublesome figures in all of Norse mythology. He explains that Loki is the god of mischief, a shapeshifter, a trickster, and the youngest son of Odin, the all-powerful king of the Norse gods. Loki, according to this mythology, was never like his brothers. He was wild, unpredictable, and incapable of behaving himself. He constantly caused embarrassment and trouble for his family, pulling pranks and creating chaos wherever he went. While the other Norse gods were noble, honorable, and dignified, Loki was the rebellious outlier, the one who could never simply follow the rules. Dr. Newman goes on to explain that Loki, in an act of divine mischief, created a powerful magical mask and released it into the mortal world. This mask, known as the Mask of Loki, carried within it all of Loki's supernatural powers. Anyone who put on the mask would be immediately transformed, gaining the ability to shape-shift, defy the laws of physics, produce objects from nothing, and essentially operate with cartoon-like invincibility and chaos. Loki's intention was for the mask to spread disorder and mayhem throughout the human world, which it did very effectively. However, Loki's behavior eventually reached a breaking point. His father Odin, fed up with his youngest son's endless troublemaking and embarrassing conduct, punished Loki severely by imprisoning him. The mask, meanwhile, remained loose in the mortal world, passed from person to person over the centuries, leaving a trail of chaos wherever it landed. As Dr. Newman reaches the part of the story where he describes Loki's imprisonment, something unexpected happens. One of the visitors in the tour group, a man dressed entirely in dark clothing who had been watching quietly from the back, suddenly reacts with visible fury. His body begins to change. His features contort and transform, and before the stunned tourist can fully process what is happening, the stranger reveals himself to be none other than Loki himself, the actual Norse god of mischief, standing in the museum in the present day. Loki is furious. He is humiliated by the way his story is being told to a group of ordinary humans, and he is in no mood for patience. He immediately moves toward the display case containing what he believes to be his mask. He reaches in, grabs it, and inspects it, only to discover with even greater fury that the mask on display is nothing more than a replica. It is a fake. His real mask is somewhere out there in the world, and he has no idea where it is. In his rage, Loki lashes out at the museum, creates a scene of mayhem, and then storms out into the world, determined to find his mask before his father discovers it is still missing. This opening sequence establishes the central conflict of the entire film. Loki needs his mask back. Odin is already disappointed and angry with his son. And somewhere in the mortal world, the real mask of Loki is waiting to be found. Introducing Tim Avery and his world. The story then transitions to a fictional American town called Fringe City, where we meet the heart of the film, a young man named Tim Avery. Tim is an aspiring cartoonist in his late 20s who works at an animation company. He is creative, imaginative, and deeply passionate about drawing and storytelling. He has spent the last 10 years working at this company, pouring his heart into his craft, but despite his dedication and talent, his career has not gone anywhere meaningful. He is stuck in a low-level position, mostly tasked with wearing a turtle costume and wandering around the office entertaining children at events, rather than being given the opportunity to pitch his own original ideas and characters. Tim is also navigating a major life transition. His wife Tonya is pregnant, and the couple is expecting their first child very soon. While Tonya is excited and emotionally prepared for the arrival of their baby, Tim is struggling deeply with the idea of becoming a father. He feels unprepared. He does not trust himself. He worries that he does not have what it takes to be a good parent, and this anxiety sits heavy on his chest throughout the early part of the film. The one relationship in Tim's life where he feels entirely comfortable and confident is his relationship with his dog, Otis, affectionately nicknamed Bear. Otis is a big, lovable, expressive dog who has been Tim's best friend for years. The two share a deep bond, and Tim treats Otis with enormous love and affection. Otis, for his part, adores Tim completely and is used to being the center of his owner's world. This comfort and companionship is the one stable thing in Tim's otherwise uncertain life. Tim's best friend at work is a man named Jorge, a funny and warm-hearted guy who struggles with his own insecurities, particularly around women. Jorge is supportive of Tim and consistently encourages him to be bolder in his career, pushing him to approach their boss, Daniel Moss, and pitch his original cartoon ideas. Daniel Moss is a dry, deadpan, largely unenthused man who runs the company with minimal emotional investment in anything. The mask arrives, Halloween night. The turning point of the first act comes when Otis, while wandering near a creek one day, stumbles upon something half buried in the mud and water. He noses around it, digs it out, and brings it home in his mouth. What Otis has found is the ancient mask of Loki, the very object Loki is now frantically searching for. Otis drops it in the house, and it sits there unremarkably until Tim finds it. The night of the company's Halloween party arrives, and Tim is still feeling like a fish out of water. Everyone is dressed in costumes, and Tim, looking for something to wear, picks up the strange green mask that Otis brought home. He holds it for a moment, turns it over in his hands, and then, almost casually, puts it on his face. The transformation is immediate and total. The moment the mask of Loki connects with Tim's face, it fuses to him and floods him with divine supernatural power. Tim is no longer simply Tim. He becomes a wild, frantic, unstoppable force of nature, a cartoon come to life with rubbery limbs, explosive energy, and the ability to bend reality according to his whims. At the Halloween party, the masked Tim becomes the most extraordinary and unforgettable presence in the room. He dances, leaps, performs impossible physical feats, and leaves everyone around him completely astonished. Later that night, Tim comes home from the party still wearing the mask. In this state, he and Tonya conceive their child. This moment is the most consequential event of the entire film, because the child conceived while Tim is wearing the mask of Loki will not be an ordinary human child. The supernatural power of the mask passes into the very DNA of the baby being created, with consequences that will not become clear until 9 months later. The birth of Alvi, a baby unlike any other. 9 months pass, and Tonya gives birth to a healthy baby boy. The couple names him Alvi. From the outside, Alvi looks like a perfectly normal, adorable infant. But it does not take long for Tim and Tonya to realize that their son is anything but ordinary. Alvi, from his very earliest days, begins exhibiting abilities that no human baby has ever possessed. His face stretches. His body morphs. He produces objects from thin air. He floats, spins, and interacts with the world around him in ways that completely defy the laws of physics and biology. Unlike the mask, which must be physically worn in order to activate its powers, Alvi does not need the mask at all. The powers of Loki are inside him. They are part of him. He was born with them, and he uses them constantly, freely, and without any understanding of consequences or control. For Tonya, the experience of motherhood is already intense on a purely biological level, but for Tim, the arrival of Alvi triggers an even deeper crisis of confidence. He already doubted his ability to be a good father to a normal child. Now he is responsible for an infant with godlike powers who can reshape reality on a whim. Every diaper change, every feeding, every attempt to put the baby to sleep becomes an adventure in chaos and impossibility. Alvi's cartoonish abilities mean that the simplest tasks of parenting become elaborate, physically demanding, and often dangerous undertakings. While Tim and Tonya try desperately to manage and understand what is happening with their son, there is another member of the family who is deeply unhappy about the arrival of Alvi, and that is Otis the dog. Otis the dog, jealousy and the mask. Before Alvi was born, Otis was everything to Tim. He was Tim's companion, his comfort, his source of joy. Tim would spend hours with Otis, walking him, playing with him, talking to him as though he were a person. Otis received enormous amounts of love and attention and had grown completely accustomed to being the most important presence in Tim's daily life. The arrival of baby Alvi changes everything for Otis almost overnight. Tim and Tonya are now consumed by the demands of new parenthood. Their attention, their energy, their time, and their emotional bandwidth are all devoted to the baby. Otis is fed and watered, but the deep, affectionate bond he once shared with Tim has been pushed to the background. Otis watches from the edges of rooms as Tim holds the baby, talks to the baby, and focuses entirely on the baby. The jealousy builds slowly at first, and then rapidly and powerfully. What makes this situation even more complicated is that Otis discovers the mask of Loki, which has been left lying around the house. Being a dog with no understanding of supernatural mythology, Otis simply does what dogs do with interesting objects. He picks it up and puts it on. The mask works on Otis just as powerfully as it worked on Tim. The moment the mask attaches to Otis's face, the dog transforms into a supernaturally powered, mischievous, and highly motivated animal with the full abilities of Loki at his disposal. From this point forward, the domestic scenes of the film take on a classic cartoon war dynamic. Otis, wearing the mask and fueled by jealousy, begins devising plans and schemes to deal with Alvy. The baby, possessing his own innate powers, responds in kind. The two of them engage in an escalating battle of tricks, traps, and impossible physical confrontations that tear through the Avery household like a hurricane. Furniture is destroyed, walls are broken, ceilings are dented, and the entire house becomes a battlefield straight out of a Tom and Jerry cartoon. Meanwhile, Tim and Tonya are caught in the middle, trying desperately to maintain some semblance of order and normalcy in a home that has become anything but normal. Loki arrives in Fringe City. While the chaos at the Avery household continues to build, Loki has been relentlessly tracking the mask. His search has eventually led him to Fringe City, and he arrives in the mortal world with a single mission in mind: find the mask of Loki and bring it back to the realm of the Norse gods before Odin discovers just how long his son has allowed the mask to remain unaccounted for. Loki is not accustomed to the human world. He is a god, ancient and powerful, who has very little patience for the mundane details of ordinary human life. He finds humans confusing, frustrating, and largely irritating. But he is also highly intelligent and capable of disguising himself, using his shape-shifting abilities to blend into the human world when necessary. As Loki closes in on the Avery family, he begins to sense the energy of his mask and realizes that it is not simply sitting somewhere waiting to be picked up. The situation is far more complicated than he anticipated. The mask has become entangled with a human family in a way that is going to require more than simply walking in and taking it back. Loki watches the Avery family from a distance and observes the situation. He sees the baby with powers. He sees the dog with the mask. He sees the exhausted and overwhelmed Tim struggling to manage it all. And he realizes that retrieving his mask is going to be a far more involved process than he originally planned. His attempts to infiltrate the family's life and reclaim the mask lead to a series of increasingly wild and chaotic confrontations. Loki uses his divine abilities to manipulate, trick, and pursue his goal, but every attempt is met with unexpected complications, largely because a baby with the powers of a Norse god is not something even Loki himself fully anticipated having to deal with. Tim's struggle with fatherhood. Running alongside all of the supernatural chaos is a very human emotional story at the core of the film. Tim Avery is not just trying to survive the physical impossibility of his situation. He is also fighting an internal battle with himself about what kind of father he wants to be and whether he is capable of being the parent his son needs. Throughout the film, Tim makes mistakes. He is distracted by his career ambitions, frustrated by the chaos in his home, and genuinely unsure of how to connect with a child who operates on an entirely different level of existence. There are moments where he feels like he is failing completely, where the gap between the father he wants to be and the father he currently is feels enormous and unbridgeable. Tonya, for her part, is doing her best to hold everything together, but the strain of their situation tests their relationship. She loves Tim and she loves Alvy, but she needs Tim to step up and be present in a way that he has not yet fully managed to do. The couple's relationship is put under real pressure by the events of the film, and Tim must confront the fact that running away from the responsibilities of fatherhood is not an option. This emotional journey is the backbone of the story. The supernatural elements, the cartoon battles, the divine mythology, all of it is built around the simple and relatable story of a man learning to embrace his role as a father, finding courage he did not know he had, and choosing to show up for his family even when everything around him is completely out of control. Odin intervenes, the gods come to Earth. As the situation continues to spiral beyond Loki's control, his father Odin finally loses patience entirely. Odin, the king of the Norse gods, is a figure of immense authority, power, and gravity. He is everything Loki is not: composed, commanding, and deeply serious about order and responsibility. He has been watching Loki's failures with growing anger, and when it becomes clear that Loki is not going to resolve this situation on his own, Odin decides to come to the mortal world himself. The arrival of Odin in Fringe City elevates the stakes of the entire film to their highest point. Now it is not just a mischievous god chasing a magical mask through the streets of a suburban American town. It is the king of the Norse gods himself, arriving to impose divine justice on a situation that has gotten completely out of hand. Odin's presence forces a confrontation not just between the gods and the Avery family, but between Odin and Loki directly. The father-son dynamic between Odin and Loki mirrors, in exaggerated and mythological terms, the father-son dynamic that Tim is trying to navigate with baby Alvi. Both stories are ultimately about fathers and sons, about the tension between authority and love, between expectation and acceptance, between disappointment and reconciliation. The climax and resolution. The film builds to a dramatic and visually extravagant climax that brings together all of its threads. Tim, who has spent the entire film running from his fears and struggling with his identity as a father, is finally forced into a moment of decisive action. He must confront Loki, deal with the chaos that the mask has brought into his family's life, and make choices that demonstrate, clearly and without ambiguity, that he is ready to be the father and husband his family needs him to be. The baby Alvi, despite being an infant with no understanding of the larger events around him, plays a central role in the climax through the sheer power of his abilities. The confrontation between Loki, Odin, Tim, and Alvi is an enormous spectacle of supernatural powers colliding in a suburban setting, with visual effects sequences that push the boundaries of what the technology of the time could produce. In the end, the mask of Loki is dealt with in a way that resolves the central conflict. Loki, despite being the antagonist of the story, is not entirely without sympathy. His relationship with his father Odin is complicated and painful, and the film treats this dynamic with a small degree of emotional nuance, suggesting that Loki's mischief and troublemaking are in part a product of a difficult relationship with an impossibly demanding father figure. The divine conflict between Odin and Loki reaches a resolution that involves both justice and a measure of understanding. The supernatural threat to the Avery family is removed, and peace is restored to their home. Most importantly, Tim Avery emerges from the ordeal transformed. The reluctant, anxious, self-doubting man who entered the film terrified of fatherhood has been replaced by someone who has genuinely grown through the experience. He has faced impossible challenges, made mistakes, found his courage, and ultimately chosen his family above everything else. His relationship with Tonya is restored and strengthened. His bond with baby Alvi is no longer a source of fear but a source of genuine love and commitment. Even Otis the dog finds his place in the new family order. The jealousy that drove him to put on the mask and wage war against the baby is resolved through a shift in the family dynamic. As Tim becomes more present and engaged as a father, Otis finds that there is still love for him in this family, that the arrival of a baby does not mean the end of his relationship with Tim, but simply the beginning of a new and expanded family unit. The film ends with the Avery family restored to a version of normalcy, which in their case will likely never be entirely ordinary given what they have been through, but is filled with warmth, love, and the hard-earned peace of a family that has survived something extraordinary together. Jamie Kennedy. Jamie Kennedy was born on May 25, 1970, in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania, a suburb just outside of Philadelphia. He grew up in a working-class household and from a very young age showed a strong interest in performing and making people laugh. His childhood was relatively ordinary, but his personality was always larger than life. He was the kind of kid who thrived on attention and found that humor was his most natural way of connecting with the people around him. Growing up in Pennsylvania gave him a grounded, blue-collar sensibility that would later inform much of his comedic style, which was always rooted in real observation and an ability to find the ridiculous in everyday situations. As a teenager, Kennedy became increasingly serious about the idea of pursuing a career in entertainment. He was not a straight-A student focused on a traditional academic path. Instead, his energy and attention went toward performing, watching films, studying comedians he admired, and dreaming about making it in Hollywood. After finishing school, he made the decision that many aspiring performers make, which is to pack up and head to Los Angeles, the center of the American entertainment industry. He arrived in the city with ambition but very little else, and like the vast majority of people who chase that dream, he spent years struggling. His early years in Hollywood were marked by rejection, small roles, and the grinding uncertainty that defines the early career of almost every actor who eventually makes it. He worked small jobs, went to countless auditions, and took whatever opportunities came his way, no matter how minor. He appeared in small television roles and low-level productions throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, slowly building his experience and his reputation within the industry without yet breaking through to any significant level of recognition. The breakthrough that changed everything for Jamie Kennedy came in 1996 when he was cast in Wes Craven's horror film Scream. This film was a cultural phenomenon. It revitalized the slasher horror genre, became one of the most talked about films of the decade, and introduced a self-aware, intelligent approach to horror storytelling that was completely fresh at the time. Kennedy played Randy Meeks, a movie-obsessed film nerd who serves as the character who understands and articulates the rules of horror films while simultaneously living through one. Randy became one of the most beloved characters in the film, and Kennedy's performance was widely praised for its wit, timing, and genuine charm. He reprised the role in Scream 2 in 1997, further cementing his place in pop culture history. Following the success of Scream, Kennedy transitioned into television and became the star of his own hidden camera prank show called The Jamie Kennedy Experiment, which aired on the WB network. The show ran for 3 seasons beginning in 2002 and was enormously popular, drawing large audiences and establishing Kennedy as one of the most recognizable comedic faces on American television at the time. The format involved Kennedy disguising himself in elaborate costumes and characters to prank unsuspecting members of the public, and his ability to commit completely to outrageous characters without breaking was central to the show's appeal. Riding the wave of his television success, Kennedy took on the lead role in Son of the Mask in 2005. The film was a massive studio production with a budget of nearly $100 million, and Kennedy was being positioned as a leading man capable of carrying a major Hollywood comedy franchise. The experience, however, turned out to be one of the most difficult of his career. The film was brutally received by critics and was a significant box office disappointment. The volume and intensity of the negative criticism directed at Kennedy personally took a real toll on him. He spoke openly about how deeply affected he was by the reception of the film, and it clearly had a lasting impact on how he viewed the relationship between artists and critics. In response to this experience, Kennedy channeled his feelings into a creative project. He co-created and appeared in a 2007 documentary film called Heckler, which examined the culture of heckling and professional criticism. The documentary featured interviews with numerous comedians and performers talking about their own experiences with harsh public criticism, and it was Kennedy's way of processing and confronting something that had genuinely wounded him. The film was well received within the comedy community and demonstrated a more serious and reflective side of Kennedy that many audiences had not seen before. Throughout the later years of his career, Kennedy continued working steadily in both film and television. He appeared in a wide variety of projects across multiple genres, demonstrating a range and willingness to take risks that kept him relevant in an industry where staying power is never guaranteed. He also continued performing stand-up comedy, which had always been a core part of his identity as a performer. Stand-up allowed him to remain connected to live audiences and to continue developing his comedic voice in its most direct and unmediated form. Kennedy also became known for being very candid and self-aware about his career, including its highs and lows. Starting in 2021, he began releasing a series of detailed and honest videos on his YouTube channel in which he discussed his experience making Son of the Mask at length. These videos showed a performer who had made peace with a difficult chapter of his career and was willing to discuss it with transparency and even humor. The response from audiences was warm, and many people appreciated the honesty and vulnerability he brought to those conversations. Alan Cumming. Alan Cumming was born on January 27, 1965, in Aberfeldy, a small town in Perthshire, Scotland. His childhood was far from easy. He grew up in a household marked by a deeply troubled relationship with his father, who was a harsh and emotionally abusive presence in his life. Cumming has spoken about his childhood and his father extensively in interviews and in his memoir, describing years of emotional and psychological difficulty that left a significant mark on him. His mother was a source of warmth and love in an otherwise difficult home environment, and his relationship with her remained one of the most important in his life. Despite the difficulties of his upbringing, Cumming found solace and purpose in performance from a very young age. He was drawn to acting, to the stage, and to the transformative power of inhabiting characters. He attended the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama in Glasgow, one of the most prestigious performing arts institutions in Scotland, where he trained rigorously and developed the technical foundation that would underpin his entire career. His time there was formative, not just in terms of craft, but in terms of identity. The performing arts world gave him a community, and a sense of belonging that he had not always felt in his personal life growing up. After completing his training, Cumming began building his career in British theatre and television. He worked extensively on the British stage throughout the late 1980s and into the 1990s, taking on a wide variety of roles and establishing himself as a performer of exceptional range and commitment. His stage work during this period earned him significant recognition within the British theatre world, and he became known as someone who could move between comedy and drama with equal skill and conviction. His international breakthrough came through a combination of stage and screen work that brought him to the attention of American audiences. One of his most celebrated early achievements was his performance in the musical Cabaret on Broadway, where he played the role of the MC. His portrayal of this character was a sensation. He brought a dark, seductive, deeply unsettling energy to the role that completely transformed the production and left audiences and critics stunned. He won the Tonya Award for Best Actor in a Musical for this performance, which is the highest honor in American theater, and it established him as a truly world-class performer on the international stage. Around this same period, Cumming was also building a significant film career. He appeared in GoldenEye in 1995, the James Bond film starring Pierce Brosnan, playing a memorable villain. He appeared in Eyes Wide Shut in 1999, Stanley Kubrick's final film, and in Romy and Michelle's high school reunion in 1997, where he demonstrated his effortless comedic timing in a very different kind of role. He played the shape-shifting mutant Nightcrawler in X2, X-Men United in 2003, a role that required him to spend long hours in an extraordinarily complex makeup and prosthetics process every single day of filming. His performance as Nightcrawler was widely praised and became one of the most memorable aspects of that film. When he took on the role of Loki in Son of the Mask in 2005, Cumming brought his full theatrical arsenal to the part. Loki is a god of mischief, a shape-shifter, a trickster, and the kind of role that demands enormous physical commitment and a complete willingness to be outrageous. Cumming delivered all of this with total conviction. Whatever the critical reception of the film as a whole may have been, his performance was frequently cited as one of the elements that brought genuine energy and watchability to the project. His natural ability to embody flamboyant, unpredictable characters made him a perfect fit for a Norse trickster god, and he clearly had fun in the role. Beyond his acting career, Cumming has lived a rich and publicly engaged life. He came out as bisexual and has been a passionate and outspoken advocate for LGBTQ rights throughout his career. He became an American citizen in 2008 while retaining his British citizenship, making him a dual citizen. He has written a memoir titled Not My Father's Son, which explores his complicated relationship with his father and the process of confronting painful family history. The book was both critically acclaimed and deeply personal, revealing a level of courage and honesty that earned him enormous respect from readers around the world. He has continued working at an extraordinarily prolific pace across theater, film, and television, appearing in the American television series The Good Wife as the cunning political operative Eli Gold, a role that brought him a whole new generation of fans and earned him multiple award nominations. His career is a remarkable story of a man who used the transformative power of performance to transcend a difficult beginning and build a life of extraordinary creative achievement. Bob Hoskins. Bob Hoskins was born on October 26, 1942, in Berry Street, Edmonds, Suffolk, England. He was raised primarily in the Finsbury Park area of North London, which was a working-class neighborhood, and his upbringing was solidly rooted in the honest, no-nonsense culture of working-class British life. His father was a bookkeeper and his mother was a nursery school teacher and civil rights activist. The family was not wealthy but was filled with warmth, strong values, and a deep sense of community. Hoskins grew up surrounded by the vibrant, rough-edged energy of North London street life, and this background gave him an authenticity and groundedness that would define his work as an actor for his entire career. Hoskins did not follow a conventional path into acting. He did not attend drama school or train formally in any traditional sense. His entry into the profession was almost entirely accidental. As a young man, he worked a wide variety of jobs to support himself, including working as a porter at Covent Garden Market, a lorry driver, a plumber's mate, a fire eater, and a seaman. He was living the life of an ordinary working-class young man with no particular plan or direction, simply drifting through different forms of employment and experiencing the world as it came to him. The moment that changed his life came when he accompanied a friend to an audition at a theater. While waiting for his friend, Hoskins was asked by the director if he was also there to audition. Not wanting to explain the situation, and perhaps feeling a flicker of curiosity, he said yes and walked into the audition room. He performed, and to his own astonishment, he was offered the role on the spot. His friend, the one who had actually come to audition, did not get the part. This completely unplanned moment launched one of the most extraordinary acting careers in British cinematic history. From this accidental beginning, Hoskins threw himself into acting with tremendous passion and natural ability. He worked extensively in British theatre and television throughout the 1970s, building up a body of work and a reputation as a performer of raw, intense, and deeply human power. His stocky build, expressive face, and unmistakable voice gave him a screen presence that was impossible to ignore. He was not a conventionally handsome leading man in the traditional Hollywood sense, but he had something far more valuable, which was an absolute and total believability in every role he took on. When Bob Hoskins appeared on screen, audiences believed him completely. His international breakthrough came with the 1980 British television serial Pennies from Heaven, in which he played a sheet music salesman living a life of quiet desperation, and then even more dramatically with the 1980 British gangster film The Long Good Friday, in which he played Harold Shand, a powerful London crime boss whose world begins to collapse around him. His performance in The Long Good Friday is considered one of the greatest acting achievements in British cinema history. He brought a volcanic intensity and a tragic humanity to the role that elevated the film far beyond the conventions of the gangster genre, and it announced him to the world as a performer of the very highest order. Hollywood came calling after The Long Good Friday, and Hoskins made the transition to American cinema while continuing to maintain his work in Britain. He received an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor for his role in the 1986 film Mona Lisa, in which he played a small-time criminal who becomes a driver for a high-class escort and develops a complex emotional attachment to her. His performance was heartbreaking, tender, and utterly convincing, and it remains one of the finest performances ever captured on film. The role that brought him to the widest possible global audience came in 1988 with Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Robert Zemeckis' groundbreaking hybrid of live-action filmmaking and animation. Hoskins played Eddie Valiant, a hard-boiled private detective living in a world where cartoon characters exist alongside human beings. The technical demands of the role were extraordinary, requiring Hoskins to interact convincingly with animated characters that would only be added to the film in post-production, meaning he had to perform entire scenes reacting to things that were not actually there. He pulled it off with complete mastery, and the film became a landmark in cinema history. It is still regarded as one of the most technically ambitious and purely entertaining films ever made. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, Hoskins continued working constantly across an enormous range of films and genres. He appeared in Hook alongside Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman in 1991, in Nixon in 1995, in Michael in 1996, and in numerous other productions that demonstrated his remarkable versatility. He took on the role of Odin in Son of the Mask in 2005, bringing his characteristic gravitas and authority to the king of the Norse gods. Even in a film that struggled critically, Hoskins brought dignity and genuine screen presence to every moment he appeared. In his personal life, Hoskins was known as a deeply warm, generous, and grounded man who never lost touch with his working-class roots despite achieving enormous fame and success. He was married twice and had 4 children, and by all accounts he was a devoted and loving family man who kept his personal life largely private and separate from the world of celebrity. Tragically, Bob Hoskins was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in 2012. He announced his retirement from acting upon receiving the diagnosis, stating that the condition made it impossible for him to continue working. He spent his final years with his family, away from the public eye. He passed away on April 29, 2014, at the age of 71. His death was mourned deeply throughout the film industry and by audiences around the world who had loved him for decades. He left behind a body of work that stands as a testament to what an actor can achieve through pure talent, total commitment, and an unshakable connection to human truth. Kal Penn. Kal Penn was born Kalpen Suresh Modi on April 23, 1977, in Montclair, New Jersey. He grew up in a family of Indian origin, and his upbringing was shaped by the dual experience of being the child of immigrant parents in suburban America, navigating between 2 cultures and 2 sets of expectations simultaneously. His parents were hardworking and placed enormous value on education and professional achievement, as is common in many immigrant families of South Asian background. The expectation in his household, as in many similar families, was that their son would pursue a stable and prestigious career path, something in medicine, engineering, law, or another similarly respectable profession. Kal Penn, however, had different ideas. From a young age, he was drawn to performing. He loved being in front of people, loved the idea of storytelling, and felt a genuine pull toward the entertainment industry that he could not ignore no matter how much he understood the practical concerns his parents had about such an uncertain career path. He began performing in school productions and community theater, developing his confidence and his craft in whatever spaces were available to him. He went on to study at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he studied theater. His decision to pursue acting professionally was not without friction in his family life. His parents wanted security for their son, and the entertainment industry is famously insecure, particularly for performers from minority backgrounds who face additional barriers that their white counterparts do not. Penn was acutely aware of these challenges but pressed forward regardless, driven by a passion for the craft that outweighed his fear of failure. His early years in Hollywood were marked by the particular frustrations that have historically confronted South Asian actors in the American entertainment industry. Roles for actors of his background were limited and often consisted of stereotypes, caricatures, and supporting parts that did little to showcase real talent or tell meaningful stories. Penn found himself being asked to audition for roles that reduced Indian American identity to a collection of accents and cliches, and he consistently pushed back against this, refusing to build his career on a foundation of self-degrading representation. The turning point of his career came with Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle in 2004, in which he co-starred alongside John Cho. This film was a revelation in many respects. It was a comedy, irreverent and silly and enormously entertaining, but at its heart it was something more significant. It centered two Asian American characters as fully realized, complex, funny, and deeply human protagonists rather than sidekicks or stereotypes. The film was a genuine hit with audiences and became a cult classic almost immediately upon release. Penn's performance as Kumar was loose, charismatic, and genuinely hilarious, and it demonstrated a natural comedic gift that instantly made him one of the most exciting young comedic actors in Hollywood. He appeared in Son of the Mask the same year, playing Tim Avery's best friend Jorge in a supporting role. The Harold and Kumar franchise continued with 2 successful sequels, and Penn's profile continued to rise throughout the mid-2000s. He also appeared in serious dramatic work, most notably in the acclaimed television series House MD, where he played Lawrence Kuttner, a medical fellow working under the brilliant and abrasive Dr. Gregory House. His performance in that show demonstrated a dramatic range that surprised many people who knew him primarily from his comedic work. Then, in one of the most remarkable career pivots in recent entertainment history, Kal Penn chose to leave his acting career temporarily to serve in the administration of President Barack Obama. In 2009, he was appointed as Associate Director of the White House Office of Public Engagement, a position in which he served for approximately 2 years before returning to acting. This decision shocked the entertainment world but also earned him enormous respect from many quarters, as it demonstrated that Penn saw himself as more than simply a performer and was genuinely committed to public service and political engagement. After returning to acting, Penn continued working across film, television, and later became involved in political commentary and advocacy work. He came out publicly as gay in 2021, announcing in a memoir that he had been in a relationship with his partner Josh for many years. His coming out was met with an outpouring of support from fans and colleagues, and he spoke about the experience of navigating his identity privately for so long in an industry and a culture that does not always make that easy. He has continued to be an outspoken voice on issues of representation, immigration, and civil rights, using his platform in ways that reflect deeply held personal convictions. Traylor Howard. Traylor Howard was born on June 14, 1966, in Orlando, Florida. She grew up in the American South and from an early age showed an interest in performance and the arts. Her path into acting was more gradual and quietly determined than some of her contemporaries, and she built her career steadily, and without the kind of dramatic overnight breakthrough that some performers experience. After completing her education, she moved toward pursuing acting professionally and began working in television, which would become the primary medium of her career. She is perhaps best known to American television audiences for her role as Sharon Carter in the long-running sitcom Two Guys, A Girl and a Pizza Place, which aired from 1998 to 2001. This show, which also starred Ryan Reynolds in one of his earliest high-profile roles, was a popular ensemble comedy that ran for 4 seasons and gave Howard significant national exposure as a comedic actress. She later became widely recognized for her role as Natalie Teeger in the USA Network detective series Monk, in which she played the assistant and companion to the brilliant but deeply troubled obsessive-compulsive detective Adrian Monk. Monk was an enormously popular series that ran for 8 seasons, and Howard's character became a beloved part of the show's identity. Her warmth, humor, and genuine chemistry with Tony Shalhoub, who played the lead character, made her an essential part of what made the show work as well as it did. In Son of the Mask, Howard played Tonya Avery, the wife of Jamie Kennedy's character Tim and the mother of the supernaturally powered baby Alvy. The role required her to be the emotional anchor of a film that was otherwise driven by chaos, visual effects, and broad physical comedy, and she brought a grounded warmth to the character that gave the human story of the film whatever emotional weight it carried. Traylor Howard has maintained a relatively private personal life throughout her career, focusing on her work and her family rather than seeking the kind of celebrity spotlight that some performers pursue. She is regarded within the industry as a reliable, talented, and thoroughly professional actress whose contributions to the projects she has been part of have consistently added genuine value. The budget and the making of Son of the Mask, 2005. When New Line Cinema greenlit Son of the Mask, they made a decision that many would later look back on with a great deal of confusion and disbelief. They decided to spend an enormous amount of money on a sequel to a film whose original star had already made it crystal clear that he would not be returning. The production budget for Son of the Mask was estimated to be somewhere between $84 million and $100 million US. This was not a small independent film trying to get by on limited resources. This was a major Hollywood studio throwing nearly $100 million at a project, which makes the eventual outcome of the film all the more striking as a case study in how money alone cannot guarantee quality or success. To put that number in context, the original 1994 film The Mask, which starred Jim Carrey and became a global phenomenon, was made for a budget of approximately $23 million. It went on to gross over $350 million worldwide. It was a triumph of creative vision, charismatic performance, and innovative visual effects that captured the imagination of audiences around the world. Son of the Mask costs roughly 4 to 5 times as much to make as the original, and yet it grossed only $59.9 million worldwide, which means it did not even come close to recovering its production costs. When you factor in marketing and distribution expenses on top of the production budget, the financial loss to the studio was enormous. The question of why the budget was so high is an interesting one. A significant portion of the money went toward the visual effects, which were handled by 2 of the most respected effects companies in the entire industry. Industrial Light and Magic, the legendary visual effects company founded by George Lucas that had worked on the Star Wars films, the Indiana Jones films, and countless other landmark productions, was brought in to handle a large portion of the effects work. Tippett Studio, another highly regarded visual effects company founded by the Oscar-winning effects artist Phil Tippett, also contributed significantly to the film. Together, these 2 companies were responsible for creating the cartoon-like physical transformations, the supernatural abilities of baby Alvy, the shape-shifting powers of Loki, and all of the impossible physical gags that formed the visual backbone of the film. The effects themselves were extraordinarily complex and time-consuming to produce. Creating a convincing digital baby that could perform superhuman feats while still looking like a real infant was a technical challenge of the highest order. The filmmakers needed audiences to look at baby Alvy and believe simultaneously that he was a real child and that he was doing things no real child could ever do. Achieving this balance required an enormous amount of digital work, compositing real footage of the infant twins Ryan and Liam Falconer with digitally created elements and enhancements. Every sequence involving the baby performing supernatural acts required close collaboration between the on-set production team and the digital effects artists working in post-production, and this kind of work is extraordinarily expensive and labor-intensive. The dog Otis, played by an animal actor named Bear, also required a significant amount of effects work, particularly in the sequences where Otis wears the mask and transforms into a supernaturally powered animal. Creating convincing digital enhancements to a real dog while maintaining the dog's natural expressiveness and charm was another technical challenge that consumed considerable time and resources. The sequences involving Otis and baby Alvy battling each other in cartoon fashion required what were essentially fully animated sequences built on top of or alongside real footage, and these sequences pushed the technology of the time to its limits. The film was primarily shot at Fox Studios Australia in Sydney, which is one of the most well-equipped and technically sophisticated production facilities in the Southern Hemisphere. Fox Studios Australia had been the home of major productions including The Matrix films and several large American studio pictures, and it offered the kind of massive sound stages, technical infrastructure, and production support that a film of this scale required. The decision to shoot in Australia was also influenced by financial considerations, as Australian production costs and government incentives made large-scale filmmaking there more economical than comparable work in the United States, even after accounting for the cost of relocating cast and crew to the other side of the world. Principal photography began on November 24, 2003, and wrapped on April 3, 2004, giving the production a shooting schedule of a little over 4 months. This was already a significant undertaking, but the reality of making the film turned out to be far more complicated and exhausting than even the most pessimistic pre-production estimates had suggested. One of the primary sources of difficulty throughout the production was working with the infant twins Ryan and Liam Falconer, who together played baby Alvy. Working with babies on a film set is notoriously one of the most challenging aspects of any production. Babies cannot take direction. They cannot perform on cue. They cannot be asked to look in a particular direction, hold a particular expression, or repeat a moment that worked well in a previous take. They operate entirely on their own schedule, responding only to their immediate physical and emotional needs, and no amount of professional experience or technical expertise can change this fundamental reality. The Falconer twins were, by all accounts, extremely well looked after on set, with their parents and a team of caregivers always present to ensure their comfort, safety, and well-being. But the practical demands of filming with 2 very young children who had no understanding of what a film set was or what was expected of them created constant logistical challenges. Scenes that might have taken a few hours to film with adult actors could take entire days when the babies were involved, and the unpredictability of their moods, energy levels, and attention spans meant that the production schedule was in constant flux. Jamie Kennedy spoke extensively about how exhausting the filming process was, and he identified the work with the twins and with Bear the dog as among the most draining aspects of the entire production. Animals and babies on film sets are famously unpredictable, and having both simultaneously in major scenes created a level of on-set chaos that required enormous patience, adaptability, and good humor from everyone involved. The funny and chaotic scenes on set. The behind-the-scenes stories from the making of Son of the Mask paint a picture of a production that was as chaotic and unpredictable in real life as the film it was trying to create was on screen. Many of the funniest and most memorable stories from the making of the film involve the very elements that made the production so challenging in the first place, namely the babies, the dog, and the sheer physical absurdity of trying to make a live-action cartoon. One of the most frequently discussed aspects of the behind-the-scenes experience was the behavior of Bear the dog, who played Otis. Bear was a large, energetic, and thoroughly unimpressed animal who had his own very clear opinions about what he was and was not willing to do on any given day. Professional animal trainers worked extensively with Bear to prepare him for the various stunts and behaviors required in the script, and Bear was by most accounts a reasonably well-trained animal. However, well-trained is a relative term when it comes to dogs, and there were numerous occasions on set when Bear simply decided that whatever he was being asked to do was not going to happen that day. There were scenes where Bear was supposed to react to invisible stimuli, to look in specific directions, to interact with spaces where digital effects would later be added. Getting a dog to consistently look at nothing in particular in a very specific way for take after take is a comedic endeavor in itself, and the crew reportedly spent considerable time on set essentially performing elaborate pantomimes in an attempt to capture Bear's attention and direct his gaze where the shot required it. The animal trainers would use a combination of treats, toys, sounds, and creative improvisation to coax the desired behavior from Bear, and the results were not always what the script called for. There were also numerous instances where Bear, apparently unimpressed by the gravity of the scene being filmed, would simply wander off set in the middle of a take. Dogs do not understand the concept of action and cut. They do not know that the cameras are rolling or that a particular moment is important. When Bear felt like going somewhere, he went, and the entire crew would have to pause, retrieve the dog, reset the scene, and try again. This happened enough times during the production that it became something of a running joke among the crew, who developed a sort of resigned affection for Bear's complete indifference to the demands of professional filmmaking. The scenes involving the infant twins were similarly filled with moments that could only be described as genuinely funny in retrospect, even if they were deeply frustrating in the moment. One of the particular challenges with infant actors is that they tend to find the most interesting things on set to look at, and those things are almost never what the director needs them to look at. The lights, the cameras, the faces of the crew, the general visual chaos of a large film production, all of these things were far more fascinating to the Falconer twins than any scripted action they were supposed to be involved in. There were reportedly many takes where a perfectly choreographed scene would be entirely derailed because one of the twins suddenly became fascinated by something happening just off camera and turned his head completely away from the scene at the critical moment. The filmmakers would then need to wait for the baby's attention to naturally drift back to where it needed to be, or find some creative way of redirecting his focus, before attempting to take again. This process repeated itself endlessly throughout the shoot, testing the patience of everyone involved and adding significantly to the time required to complete the production. Jamie Kennedy himself has recounted stories of sitting in elaborate makeup and costume, fully prepared and ready to film a scene, only to spend hours waiting while the team worked to get usable footage of the babies. The combination of a strict production schedule, a massive budget generating enormous pressure to stay on time and on budget, and the fundamental impossibility of rushing a baby produced a kind of sustained low-level chaos that pervaded the entire production. The makeup and physical preparation required for Alan Cumming's role as Loki added another dimension of behind-the-scenes humor. Cumming, who had already endured the legendary ordeal of the X2 makeup process when he played Nightcrawler and spent hours in the makeup chair every single day of that production, was no stranger to elaborate physical transformation for a role. The Loki makeup and costume were designed to give him an otherworldly, divine appearance, and achieving this look required significant time in the makeup chair every morning before filming could begin. Cumming brought enormous theatrical energy to the set every day, and his natural tendency toward the dramatic and the flamboyant made him a lively presence in the production environment. He reportedly embraced the absurdity of the film's premise completely and threw himself into the role with total commitment, which made him a joy to watch even in rehearsal and between takes. His willingness to go completely over the top in his performance meant that there were plenty of takes where he did things that were too extreme even for the film's broad comedic sensibility, and the editing room was reportedly filled with footage of Cumming doing things that were too wild to make the final cut. The technical challenges of filming scenes where characters interact with digital effects that do not yet exist created their own category of on-set comedy. When Jamie Kennedy's character needed to react to something that baby Alvy was supposedly doing with his supernatural powers, and the real baby was not actually doing that thing, Kennedy would essentially have to react to nothing, to an empty space, to an imaginary action, and make that reaction look genuine and appropriate in the context of the scene. Actors who work heavily with visual effects describe this as one of the most technically demanding aspects of modern filmmaking, because it requires a very specific kind of imaginative commitment. Kennedy reportedly handled these moments with varying degrees of conviction depending on how many hours he had already been on set that day. The physical comedy sequences in the film, particularly those involving the cartoon-style battles between Otis and baby Alvy, required enormous amounts of preparation and coordination. These sequences were essentially planned out like animated sequences, with every action, reaction, and physical gag mapped out in advance by the visual effects teams and the director. But translating that planning into actual filmed material involved a great deal of trial and error, and many of the individual components of these sequences required the real-world actors and animals to perform very specific and often very strange actions that would only make sense once the digital elements were added around them. The constant on-set rewrites that Jamie Kennedy has mentioned in his discussions of the film created their own kind of stress and dark humor. In an ideal film production, the script is fully developed and locked before the cameras roll. In the making of Son of the Mask, this was not always the case. Changes to the script continued to happen during the shoot itself, which meant that actors would sometimes arrive on set to film a scene, only to discover that the scene had been significantly altered or in some cases replaced entirely. This is not unusual in Hollywood productions, particularly large studio films where multiple stakeholders have input into the creative direction, but it adds an element of instability to the daily experience of making the film that compounds all of the other challenges. The decision by the studio to request that the film be made sillier and more cartoonish than the original cut was also a significant moment in the production's history. According to accounts from those involved, the original cut of the film was approximately 2 hours long, which is considerably longer than the final theatrical release. When the studio saw this cut, they requested that approximately 38 minutes be removed and that the remaining film be pushed further in the direction of broad cartoon comedy. This kind of significant editorial intervention at a late stage of post-production is always a complicated and stressful process, requiring the filmmakers to reassess the entire shape and tone of what they have made and make substantial changes under time pressure. The result of this process was the theatrical cut that audiences eventually saw, which bore the marks of having been significantly reshaped from what its makers had originally envisioned. Despite all of these challenges, by all accounts the atmosphere on set was not one of misery or hostility. The cast and crew found genuine humor in the absurdity of their situation. Making a film about a baby with the powers of a Norse god, on a massive studio budget, in Australia, with a dog who refused to look at the camera, and a script being rewritten in real time, is the kind of experience that either breaks people or bonds them together through shared laughter. For the most part, it appears to have done the latter, creating a set culture that acknowledged the craziness of what they were all doing and found a way to laugh about it together even on the most difficult days. Jamie Kennedy has spoken about the experience with a mixture of fondness and exhaustion in his retrospective YouTube videos, describing it as one of the most uniquely bizarre professional experiences of his life and one that he looks back on with considerably more humor now than he was able to muster at the time. The gap between the enormous seriousness with which a $100 million studio production takes itself and the fundamental silliness of what Son of the Mask was actually about created a kind of cognitive dissonance that was a constant source of unspoken comedy throughout the making of the film. Here is the complete cultural and historical breakdown of Son of the Mask in lengthy detail. The cultural and historical context of Son of the Mask, 2005. Where this film comes from, the cultural roots of the Mask franchise. To truly understand the cultural and historical significance of Son of the Mask, you cannot simply look at the 2005 film in isolation. You have to go back much further, to the roots of the story itself, to understand why this franchise existed in the first place, what it meant to audiences, and why the sequel carried such enormous cultural weight before a single frame of it had even been filmed. The entire Mask franchise began not as a film but as a comic book series published by Dark Horse Comics, an independent American comic book publisher founded in 1986 in Milwaukee, Oregon. Dark Horse was established during a period of tremendous creative ferment in the American comic book industry, a time when independent publishers were challenging the dominance of Marvel and DC and producing work that was darker, stranger, and more experimental than what the major publishers were offering. Dark Horse became known for publishing bold, unconventional material, and The Mask, which first appeared in their anthology series in 1989 before becoming its own standalone series, was a perfect example of the kind of work that defined the publisher's identity. The original comic book version of The Mask was significantly darker and more violent than either the 1994 film or the 2005 sequel. In the comics, The Mask was not primarily a source of slapstick comedy and cartoonish fun. It was a deeply sinister and dangerous object that amplified the darkest impulses of whoever wore it, turning ordinary people into virtually unstoppable engines of violence and chaos. The comic explored genuinely dark themes about the nature of power, the corruption that comes with invincibility, and what people truly want when all restraints are removed. It was not a family-friendly story. It was a mature, violent, and philosophically provocative work that used the premise of a magical mask to explore the darkest corners of human nature. When Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema adapted the comic into a film in 1994, they made a deliberate and significant creative decision to completely reinterpret the tone and direction of the source material. Instead of the dark, violent story of the comics, they created a bright, exuberant, family-friendly comedy that leaned into the cartoonish visual possibilities of the premise and showcased Jim Carrey's extraordinary physical comedy talents. This transformation from dark comic book to bright comedy film was a creative choice that reflected both the commercial instincts of Hollywood at the time and the particular cultural moment in which the film was made. The 1990s cultural context, why The Mask was such a phenomenon. The original 1994 film arrived at a very specific moment in American popular culture, and understanding that moment is essential to understanding why the film became such a massive hit, and why its legacy created such enormous expectations for any potential sequel. The early to mid-1990s was a period of extraordinary creativity and energy in American popular entertainment. It was the era of the blockbuster comedy, a time when comedic performers with truly exceptional physical gifts could command enormous audiences and become genuine global superstars. Jim Carrey was the defining figure of this particular cultural moment. He had burst onto the mainstream consciousness with his work on the television sketch comedy show In Living Color, where his extraordinary ability to transform his face and body into something almost inhuman had made him a sensation. He had then transitioned into film with Ace Ventura, Pet Detective in 1994, and the success of that film had immediately announced him as one of the most exciting comedic talents in Hollywood. When The Mask arrived later in the same year as Ace Ventura, it gave Carrey the perfect vehicle for his particular gifts. The premise of a magical mask that transforms its wearer into a cartoon character was essentially written for a performer who could already transform himself into something approaching a cartoon character without any supernatural assistance. The film was also significant for its visual effects work, which used the then cutting-edge technology of computer-generated imagery to realize the cartoon physics of the masked character in ways that had never been seen in a live-action film before. Seeing a human being stretch, snap, and defy gravity in ways that looked genuinely like a cartoon brought to life was a genuinely new visual experience for audiences in 1994, and the film rode that novelty to enormous commercial success. The Mask was also part of a broader cultural trend in the early 1990s toward a particular kind of anarchic, irreverent, high-energy entertainment that drew heavily on the aesthetics and spirit of classic animation. This was the same period that saw the enormous success of the Looney Tunes revival, the continued popularity of classic cartoon reruns, and a general cultural affection for the golden age of American animation. Films like The Mask tapped into this nostalgia for the wild, physics-defying, consequence-free world of classic cartoons and translated it into a live-action context that felt fresh and genuinely exciting. Norse mythology and popular culture. Loki and his historical significance. One of the most culturally interesting aspects of Son of the Mask is its use of Norse mythology as the foundational framework of its story. The decision to center the film's mythology around Loki, the Norse god of mischief, and his father Odin was not simply a random creative choice. It connects the film to one of the oldest and richest mythological traditions in Western culture, and it places Son of the Mask within a much larger cultural conversation about how ancient mythology is reinterpreted and reimagined for contemporary audiences. Norse mythology originates from the pre-Christian religious and cultural traditions of the Scandinavian and Germanic peoples of Northern Europe. These are stories that were passed down through oral tradition for centuries before being written down in texts like the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, ancient Icelandic manuscripts compiled in the 13th century that preserve the mythological traditions of the Norse world. These texts tell the stories of gods like Odin, Thor, Freya, and Loki, and they paint a picture of a cosmological worldview that is deeply dramatic, morally complex, and filled with characters who feel remarkably human in their flaws and contradictions. Loki in particular is one of the most fascinating and enduring figures in all of world mythology. He is not simply a villain in the Norse tradition, despite often being portrayed as one in modern popular culture. He is a deeply complex figure who occupies an ambiguous moral position within the Norse pantheon. He is the trickster, the shapeshifter, the agent of chaos, but he is also sometimes the ally of the gods, using his cleverness to help them out of difficult situations. He is simultaneously an insider and an outsider, beloved and despised, necessary and dangerous. His relationship with Odin is central to much of the mythology, a complicated bond between the powerful, wise, and authoritative father figure and the restless, brilliant, destructive son who can never quite conform to what is expected of him. This mythological relationship between Odin and Loki carries enormous cultural weight that Son of the Mask draws upon, however lightly, in its storytelling. The dynamic of a powerful father figure disappointed in and frustrated by a rebellious and chaotic son is one of the oldest and most universal stories in human culture, and it appears in mythological traditions from ancient Greece to ancient Mesopotamia to the Norse world. Son of the Mask uses this mythological framework to tell a story that is simultaneously about ancient divine conflict and about the very modern, very human experience of fathers and sons struggling to understand each other. It is also worth noting that the cultural profile of Norse mythology has changed dramatically over the decades since Son of the Mask was made. In 2005, Norse mythology was a relatively specialized cultural interest, known primarily to students of literature, mythology enthusiasts, and fans of fantasy literature. The general mainstream audience had some awareness of Thor and Odin through their presence in comic books and popular culture, but Loki was a much less widely recognized figure than he would later become. The massive global success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and in particular Tom Hiddleston's portrayal of Loki beginning in the 2011 Thor film, transformed Loki from a relatively obscure mythological figure into one of the most recognizable and beloved characters in global popular culture. Watching Son of the Mask today, with the Marvel version of Loki so firmly established in the cultural imagination, creates an interesting double vision, as audiences naturally compare Alan Cumming's theatrical and flamboyant portrayal with the version of the character they know from the MCU. The Hollywood sequel culture of the early 2000s. Son of the Mask was made during a very specific period in Hollywood history when the studio system was increasingly focused on franchise filmmaking and the mining of existing intellectual properties for sequel potential. The early 2000s saw a dramatic acceleration of the trend toward sequels, reboots, and franchise extensions that has only intensified in the years since. Studios were looking at their back catalogs and identifying properties that had been successful in the past and asking whether those properties could be revived, extended, or reimagined for a new audience. This cultural and industrial context is essential to understanding why Son of the Mask got made at all. From a purely creative standpoint, there was no urgent artistic reason to revisit the Mask franchise in 2005 without Jim Carrey. The original film had told a complete story, its main character had resolved his arc satisfactorily, and the world it created did not obviously demand further exploration. But from a business standpoint, The Mask was a known brand with demonstrated commercial appeal, a franchise with built-in name recognition that could theoretically attract audiences on the basis of familiarity alone. This was the logic that drove much of Hollywood's sequel production during this period, and it was a logic that sometimes worked and sometimes failed spectacularly. When it worked, sequels like Shrek 2 in 2004 or X2 in 2003 exceeded the originals in both quality and commercial performance. When it failed, as with Son of the Mask, it demonstrated that brand recognition alone is not enough to sustain a franchise when the essential creative ingredients that made the original work are no longer present. The early 2000s was also a period of significant transition in terms of the technology available to filmmakers, particularly in the area of computer-generated visual effects. The success of films like the Matrix trilogy and the Lord of the Rings trilogy had demonstrated that digital visual effects could achieve things that had been completely impossible just a few years earlier, and there was a tendency in Hollywood during this period to believe that sufficiently impressive visual effects could compensate for other weaknesses in a production. Son of the Mask was in many ways a product of this belief, with its enormous budget devoted largely to creating visual spectacle through digital means. The film's place in the history of family comedy. Son of the Mask occupies an interesting place in the broader history of the American family comedy film. Family comedies have been a staple of Hollywood production since the earliest days of cinema, but the specific form that the genre took in the early 2000s was shaped by a particular set of cultural assumptions about what children and families wanted from their entertainment. The early 2000s was a period when the boundaries of what was considered appropriate content for a family film were being actively tested and sometimes transgressed. The rise of animated films from Pixar and DreamWorks had demonstrated that family entertainment could be genuinely sophisticated, emotionally resonant, and entertaining for adults and children simultaneously. At the same time, there was still a market for more straightforwardly broad, physical, slapstick-oriented family comedies that prioritized spectacle and gross-out humor over narrative sophistication. Son of the Mask fell into this second category, drawing on the tradition of broad physical comedy and cartoon-inspired slapstick that had characterized family entertainment since the days of the Three Stooges and Laurel and Hardy. Its references to classic cartoons like Tom and Jerry, Looney Tunes, and the work of Chuck Jones and Tex Avery placed it consciously within a long tradition of American animated comedy, and its attempt to translate the aesthetics of that tradition into a live-action context was one of its more genuinely interesting creative ambitions, even if the execution was not universally praised. The film's PG rating placed it in an interesting commercial space, technically family-friendly but containing elements that some parents and critics found inappropriate for younger children. This tension between the film's official family classification and some of its content was one of the things that critics pointed to as a sign of uncertainty about what audience the film was actually trying to serve. The Razzie Awards and the cultural legacy of critical failure. One of the most culturally significant aspects of Son of the Mask's legacy is its relationship with failure and with the public discourse around bad filmmaking. The film's nomination for 8 Golden Raspberry Awards in 2006, and its wins in several categories including Worst Remake or Sequel, placed it firmly within a very specific cultural tradition of celebrated cinematic failure. The Razzie Awards, which were created in 1981 by film enthusiast John Wilson as a satirical counterpoint to the Academy Awards, have become a genuine cultural institution in their own right. They serve a particular cultural function by creating a space for audiences and critics to collectively process their disappointment with films that failed to live up to expectations, particularly expensive or high-profile productions. Being nominated for a Razzie is, paradoxically, a form of cultural recognition, because it means the film in question was visible and significant enough to be worth mocking. Son of the Mask's extensive presence at the 2006 Razzies placed it in the company of other notorious Hollywood disappointments, and cemented its reputation as one of the definitive cinematic failures of the early 2000s. This reputation has had a lasting effect on the film's cultural legacy, as it has been repeatedly cited in lists of the worst films ever made and has become something of a touchstone in discussions about Hollywood excess, failed franchise extensions, and the limits of what money and technology can achieve without a strong creative foundation. However, the cultural conversation around Son of the Mask has evolved in interesting ways in the years since its release. There is a growing tradition in film culture of reassessing and reappraising films that were initially dismissed or ridiculed, finding value and interest in work that did not receive a fair hearing at the time of its release. While Son of the Mask has not undergone the kind of full critical rehabilitation that some initially dismissed films have experienced, there is a community of viewers who engage with the film on its own terms, appreciating its cartoon energy, its visual ambition, and its genuine commitment to a very specific and very strange aesthetic vision. The film as a reflection of early 2000s parenting culture. Beyond its mythological framework and its place in Hollywood franchise history, Son of the Mask is also an interesting cultural document of early 2000s attitudes toward parenthood and family life. The central emotional story of the film, in which a young man struggles with the transition from carefree adult life to the responsibilities of fatherhood, reflects anxieties and cultural conversations that were very much alive in American society in the early 2000s. The early 2000s saw a significant cultural conversation developing around the experience of modern parenthood, particularly among the generation of Americans who were becoming parents for the first time during this period. This was a generation that had grown up with significantly more personal freedom and individual focus than previous generations, and the transition to parenthood, with its radical demands on time, energy, identity, and personal autonomy, was a widely discussed cultural experience. Books, films, television shows, and magazine articles of the period frequently explored the theme of reluctant or unprepared parenthood, reflecting a genuine cultural anxiety about what it meant to take on the responsibilities of raising a child in the modern world. Tim Avery's reluctance to embrace fatherhood, his fear of losing himself in the role of parent, and his eventual journey toward acceptance and genuine love for his child tap directly into this cultural conversation. The supernatural exaggeration of the film, in which the challenges of parenting a normal baby are amplified to include a child with the powers of a Norse god, is a comedic intensification of very real and very widely shared anxieties about parenthood. In this sense, Son of the Mask participates in a long tradition of using fantasy and comedy to explore and process real human fears and experiences. The lasting cultural impact, and what the film means today. Looking at Son of the Mask from the perspective of the present day, it is possible to see the film as more culturally significant than its critical reception at the time of its release might suggest. It is a film that captures a very specific moment in Hollywood history, in the history of visual effects technology, in the history of the family comedy genre, and in the broader cultural conversation about mythology, parenthood, and the nature of creative ambition. The film's legacy has also been shaped by the personal stories of the people who made it, and how they have talked about the experience in the years since. Jamie Kennedy's candid and often funny retrospective discussions of the film on his YouTube channel have given it a second life as a cultural artifact, transforming it from simply a box office disappointment into a fascinating case study in the experience of making a major Hollywood film under difficult circumstances and living with the consequences of its reception. The broader cultural context in which the film exists has also shifted in ways that give it new layers of meaning. The enormous success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and its portrayal of the Norse gods has made Loki one of the most recognized figures in global popular culture, and watching Alan Cumming's very different interpretation of the character in Son of the Mask is now an interesting exercise in comparative mythology and character interpretation. The film also exists in a world where the conversation about cinematic failure, Hollywood excess, and the relationship between money and creative quality is more sophisticated and nuanced than it was in 2005, and Son of the Mask fits naturally into that conversation as one of its most instructive examples. It is a film that failed by most conventional measures of success. But it is also a film that has not been forgotten, that continues to be watched and discussed and argued about, and that tells us something real and interesting about the culture that produced it. In cinema, as in life, the most instructive stories are not always the ones with the happiest endings. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the honest examination of things that did not work out as planned, and Son of the Mask has plenty to teach us if we are willing to look carefully enough. And that right there, my friends, is everything you needed to know about Son of the Mask. From the very first frame of that film to the last, from the $100 million budget to the chaos happening behind the camera, from the crying babies to the dog who simply refused to cooperate, this was a movie that had one of the most extraordinary and unforgettable journeys from concept to screen that Hollywood has ever produced. It is a film that people still talk about to this day, not always for the reasons its makers intended, but talked about nonetheless. And in the world of cinema, being remembered is never nothing. What makes Son of the Mask such a fascinating subject even all these years later is not just the film itself, but everything surrounding it. The story of how it got made, who made it, what they went through to make it, and how they each carried the experience with them long after the cameras stopped rolling, that is a story just as compelling as anything that ended up on the screen. Jamie Kennedy processing his pain through a documentary about criticism. Alan Cumming bringing his full theatrical brilliance to a role that many other actors would have phoned in. Bob Hoskins showing up with his characteristic dignity and gravitas to play the king of the Norse gods in a movie about a cartoon baby. These are real human beings with real and remarkable lives, and their stories deserve to be told and appreciated in full. Cinema is a strange and wonderful thing. It brings together hundreds of people, all of them with their own histories, their own dreams, their own fears and ambitions, and asks them to collaborate in the creation of something that will outlast all of them. Sometimes that collaboration produces something transcendent. Sometimes it produces something messy and flawed and difficult to defend. And sometimes, as in the case of Son of the Mask, it produces something that sits in a very unique category of its own, a film that is fascinating not in spite of its problems but because of them. There is something genuinely human about a project that cost this much, tried this hard, and still ended up exactly where it ended up. It is a reminder that no amount of money, no amount of technical wizardry, and no amount of professional talent can fully substitute for the kind of lightning in a bottle magic that made the original film work. That magic had a name, and that name was Jim Carrey, and without him, everything downstream was always going to be fighting an uphill battle. But here is the thing that I want you to take away from this video more than anything else. Every single film ever made, no matter how poorly received, no matter how many Razzie Awards it collected, no matter how brutal the critical response was, represents thousands of hours of human effort, creativity, and genuine passion. The people who made Son of the Mask were not trying to make a bad film. They were trying to make something entertaining, something that would make audiences laugh and feel good and leave the cinema with a smile on their faces. That intention was real, even if the execution did not always match the ambition. And that deserves a measure of acknowledgement and respect, even from those of us who might find the film deeply flawed. Film is also deeply personal. Many of you watching this video right now probably have a memory attached to Son of the Mask. Maybe you watched it as a child and it made you laugh in ways you still remember. Maybe you saw it with a sibling or a parent, or a friend, and the memory of watching it together means more to you than any critic's review ever could. Those personal connections to films are real and they are valid, and no amount of professional critical consensus can take them away from you or tell you that your experience was wrong. Films belong to their audiences just as much as they belong to their makers, and the audience always gets the final word. This channel exists because of a love for cinema in all of its forms. The masterpieces and the disasters. The blockbusters and the cult classics. The films that changed the world and the films that simply tried their best and fell short. Every single one of them has a story worth telling, and every single one of them deserves to be examined with curiosity, depth, and genuine enthusiasm. That is what we do here. That is what we will always do here. So if you made it all the way to the end of this video, first of all, thank you from the bottom of my heart. That means more than you know. It means you are exactly the kind of viewer that this channel is made for. Someone who is genuinely curious, genuinely engaged, and genuinely passionate about film and the stories behind it. You are the reason this channel exists, and the reason it will keep going. Now here is what I need from you. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something new, if it made you think about this film, or about cinema in general in a way you had not before, please hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second of your time, and it makes an enormous difference to how this channel grows and how many more people get to discover this content. Every single like genuinely matters, and I want you to know that. Share this video with someone you know who loves movies. Share it with a friend who remembers watching Son of the Mask as a kid. Share it with someone who is passionate about film history and behind-the-scenes stories. Share it with anyone you think would enjoy spending time going this deep into a film that most people have either forgotten about or written off entirely. You might be surprised how much they appreciate it. And most importantly, if you are not yet a subscriber to this channel, now is the time. Hit that red subscribe button right below this video and turn on the notification bell so that every time we upload a new video, you are the first to know. We cover films like this one in complete detail, from their making to their legacy, from their cast to their cultural impact, and we do it with the kind of depth and passion that you clearly appreciate since you made it all the way to the end of this one. We have so much more content coming your way. More complete movie breakdowns. More behind-the-scenes deep dives. More actor life histories. More explorations of the films that shaped popular culture, for better or for worse. This is just the beginning, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your support. This channel is nothing without the people watching it, and every single one of you matters. Until the next video, take care of yourselves, keep watching great films, and we will see you very soon.